Dr. Mark Shanahan is an Associate Professor of Political Engagement at the University of Surrey. Welcome back to the programme, Mark. Good to see you. So last night turned out rather differently than many people had feared, with anti-racism protests replacing the ones that people had feared would be violent. Were you surprised by that?
Nicely surprised. I was very, very proud of my country and my countrymen last night. We had been all set up to face fear and hatred and more disruption from what's actually a relatively small but very noisy group of protesters. I hesitate to say protesters, of a mob of far-right people, but they were hugely overwhelmed by far larger, louder, more high-spirited and more positive crowds of anti-fascist, anti-religious hatred protesters. And it was a very good night for the country.
So perhaps difficult to pin down one reason for these protests, for these riots, but what do you think is at the heart of them? Poverty, racism, migration, or a combination of all of those?
They all play in together, but largely it comes down to a narrative that we had played out by government for the best part of a dozen years, from before Brexit, through Brexit, and really ramping up beyond. We had the narrative of division. We had the narrative of blaming systemic faults in the country, systemic faults in the politics of the country and how we develop and deliver public policy on immigrants. And that played particularly with the white working class elements of the country, parts of the country that have frankly been left behind over the last 3 or 4 decades. And that has stirred up, it's been stirred up particularly by some of our politicians who really should know better, both from the Conservative Party and further right to the fringe parties like Reform, and has been played out very much through some very systematic campaigning through social media to spread disinformation, coming from the likes of Stephen Yaxley-Lennon and his rather nasty group of far-right fringe agitators.
So how do you fix this then?
You fix it in many ways. We're already beginning to see some of the fixes in the sentences that are being handed out to those who have been arrested for their loutish behaviour and yobbish activities over the last few days. This is nothing to do with protest following the death of 3 young girls. This has been people going on the rampage, largely for their own ends, stirred up by these right-wing groups. If we could deal with social media so that the likes of Telegram don't carry these groups, so that the likes of X and Elon Musk, who bears some responsibility for this, actually acts in a much more grown-up and good business way, then that would diffuse the situation quite a lot. And then we need our own politicians, whether it is the Suella Bravermans and Priti Patels on the Conservative side, whether it's the Nigel Farages and the Richard Tices, to own this last week of agitation, to put their hands up and say that they were wrong, and that actually what works for the UK is a pluralist society. This is not the fault of immigrants, but there are things that our government must do now to address some of the inequalities in society that have seen our public services absolutely starved of the resources they need, particularly in these left-behind areas, over the last 10, 12 years. That's not going to be a quick fix. But a combination of that, plus also our media being rather more honest in the way that it reports what's happening in the UK today, will go a long way to deal with these issues.